Imagine waking up to find your entire culture being mocked by someone thousands of miles away, someone who has never set foot in your country, never experienced your traditions, and yet feels entitled to dismiss centuries of musical heritage with a single dismissive comment. This is exactly what happened when Lars Eriksson, a relatively unknown Swedish electronic music producer, decided to stream himself reacting to traditional Filipino instruments on a lazy Tuesday afternoon. What started as a casual live stream with barely 200 viewers would spiral into one of the most explosive cultural controversies the internet had seen in months. Before we dive into this incredible story of cultural clash, digital justice, and unexpected redemption, make sure to drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Lars had no idea that his careless words would unite millions of Filipinos across the globe, spark international debates about cultural respect, and ultimately change his life forever. The Kulintang's metallic resonance, the haunting melody of the kudyapi, and the rhythmic pulse of the gangsa were about to teach this Swedish musician a lesson he would never forget. Lars Eriksson was a 28-year-old music producer from Stockholm who had spent the better part of 5 years trying to make it in the competitive world of electronic dance music. His SoundCloud had a modest following of around 15,000 people, and his YouTube channel, where he occasionally streamed, had never broken past 500 concurrent viewers. On March 14th, Lars decided to do something different for his weekly stream. He announced he would be reacting to traditional instruments from around the world, comparing them to modern electronic music production. His intentions, he would later claim, were purely educational. He started with African drums, moved to Indian sitars, and praised the complexity of Japanese taiko drumming. Everything was going relatively smoothly, until his chat suggested he check out Filipino instruments. Lars pulled up a video showcasing the Kulintang, an ancient row of small gongs that produces mesmerizing melodic patterns. His face contorted almost immediately. Without hesitation, he paused the video and leaned back in his gaming chair with an expression of exaggerated disgust. His next words would become infamously screenshotted and shared millions of times across social media platforms worldwide. "This sounds like someone dropping pots and pans in a kitchen," Lars said with a dismissive laugh, his Swedish accent making the insult somehow sting even more. But he didn't stop there. He continued, emboldened by the few chat messages that seemed to agree with him. "How is this even considered music? I mean, seriously, you could achieve better sounds with a VST plugin from 2010. This is what happens when cultures don't evolve musically. They get stuck playing primitive instruments that belong in museums, not in actual musical performances." His chat began to shift uncomfortably. A few Filipino viewers who had stumbled upon his stream started typing furiously, trying to educate him about the cultural significance of the Kulintang, how it had been used in ceremonies for over 1,000 years, how its playing technique required years of training and deep cultural knowledge. But Lars was on a roll now, fueled by what he perceived as engagement. He pulled up another video, this time of the kudyapi, a two-stringed lute that produces hauntingly beautiful melodies. He barely let 10 seconds play before interrupting.
"2 strings? Seriously? My nephew has a toy guitar with more strings than this, and that sound, it's so monotonous and boring. Where's the complexity? Where's the layering? This is exactly why electronic music is superior. We've evolved past needing physical instruments that limit our creative possibilities." As Lars continued his tirade, something was happening that he hadn't noticed. His viewer count was climbing rapidly. From 200, it jumped to 500, then 1,000, then 5,000. But these weren't fans coming to support him. These were Filipinos and allies who had been tagged in the stream by outraged viewers, people who were watching in real time as their cultural heritage was being systematically mocked and dismissed. Screenshots were already circulating on Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. The clips were being downloaded, subtitled, and shared with increasing velocity across Filipino communities worldwide. In Manila, it was early morning, and people checking their phones over coffee were greeted with notifications about this Swedish musician's inflammatory comments. The reaction was swift and visceral. Maria Santos, a Kulintang master from Mindanao with over 40 years of experience, was tagged in one of the videos by her granddaughter. Maria watched the clip 3 times, each viewing making her hands tremble with a mixture of anger and sadness. Here was an instrument that her grandmother had taught her, that her grandmother's grandmother had played, an instrument that carried the stories of her people, the celebrations of harvests, the mourning of losses, the marking of life's most sacred moments, being reduced to kitchen noise by someone who had likely never even heard of Mindanao. But Maria didn't respond with anger alone. She did something far more powerful. She pulled out her phone, set it up on a tripod, positioned herself behind her family's Kulintang set, an instrument that had been in her family for over a century, and she began to play. Her fingers moved with the precision of decades of practice, creating cascading melodies that interwove with rhythmic complexity that would challenge any modern musician. The piece she played was a traditional wedding celebration song, one that required her to maintain multiple rhythmic patterns simultaneously while varying the dynamics and tonal qualities by striking different parts of each gong. She recorded for 15 minutes straight, then posted it with a simple caption: "This is not kitchen noise. This is the sound of my ancestors. This is the sound of 1,000 years of musical tradition. This is Kulintang." Maria's video was the first drop in what would become a tsunami. Within 2 hours, it had been viewed over 2 million times. Filipino musicians around the world began posting their own videos. Carlos Reyes, a Filipino-American kudyapi player based in California, posted a video demonstrating the instrument's range, explaining how the 2 strings could produce dozens of different tones, depending on finger placement, plucking technique, and the subtle bending of strings. He performed a piece that showcased harmonic complexity that would impress any classical guitarist. Jazz musicians in Manila started posting videos showing how traditional Filipino rhythms had influenced contemporary music. Musicologists weighed in with threads explaining the sophisticated music theory behind Kulintang playing, how it uses a non-Western scale system that is actually more complex than the Western 12-tone system. Anthropologists shared research papers about the cultural significance of these instruments in indigenous Filipino communities. The hashtag Filipino Cultural Pride started trending worldwide, eventually reaching the #1 spot in multiple countries.
But this wasn't just about education. The Filipino internet, known for its creativity, humor, and unity when defending their culture, went into full force. Memes flooded every platform. One popular meme showed a side-by-side comparison of Lars's setup, full of expensive electronic equipment, next to a Kulintang set, with the caption, "One requires electricity and a Wi-Fi connection. The other has survived 1,000 years in countless colonizers. Guess which one is primitive?" Another viral post created a mock EDM track using only recordings of traditional Filipino instruments, and it genuinely slapped. It accumulated millions of plays within days, with international DJs and producers praising its innovative sound design. Filipino comedians created sketch videos imagining Lars trying to play Kulintang and failing miserably. Artists created beautiful illustrations of Kulintang players surrounded by their ancestors, captioned with quotes about cultural resilience. But perhaps the most devastating response came from the Filipino music production community itself. They started posting their credentials, their work with international artists, their Grammy nominations, their sold-out world tours, all while using traditional Filipino instruments incorporated into modern production. Meanwhile, Lars's stream had descended into chaos. His viewer count had peaked at over 50,000, but his chat was now completely unreadable, flooded with messages in Tagalog, English, and various Filipino languages, all expressing disappointment, anger, and demands for an apology. Lars had stopped talking about Filipino instruments after realizing something had gone catastrophically wrong, but the damage was catastrophically done. He ended the stream abruptly, but the internet never forgets, and the internet certainly never forgives without genuine contrition. Within 6 hours, every major Filipino news outlet had covered the story. International media picked it up. BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera all ran segments about the controversy, often using it as a launching point for broader discussions about cultural imperialism, the Western-centric view of what constitutes real music, and the ongoing struggles of indigenous communities to have their cultural practices respected and preserved. Academic papers that have been written about Filipino musical traditions suddenly saw unprecedented download numbers. Museums featuring Filipino instruments reported increased visitor interest. Music schools in the Philippines reported a surge in young people wanting to learn traditional instruments. Lars's social media accounts were being flooded with thousands of comments per minute. His Instagram posts from weeks ago were being bombarded with Kulintang emojis and educational comments about Filipino culture. His SoundCloud tracks were receiving one-star reviews with detailed explanations of why cultural respect matters. His professional email was receiving messages from venues canceling upcoming gigs, from collaborators distancing themselves, from sponsors pulling support. But it wasn't just professional consequences. Other musicians, particularly from indigenous communities worldwide, began sharing their own experiences of having their traditional music dismissed or mocked. A Native American flute player shared how his instrument had been called primitive. An Aboriginal didgeridoo master talked about similar dismissals. An African talking drum expert discussed the racism inherent in calling any musical tradition unevolved. The conversation had expanded beyond just Filipino instruments to become a global reckoning about respect for indigenous and traditional music. Lars had accidentally sparked one of the most significant conversations about cultural imperialism in music that the internet had seen. 3 days after the original stream, Lars finally broke his silence. He posted a video apology that was clearly scripted and rehearsed. Sitting in what looked like his bedroom, with noticeably less confidence than he'd displayed during his stream, he read from notes on his phone. "I want to apologize for my comments about Filipino musical instruments. I was ignorant and disrespectful. I didn't understand the cultural significance of these instruments, and I spoke from a place of privilege and ignorance. I'm truly sorry to the Filipino community and to everyone I offended." The apology video immediately received mixed reactions. Many felt it was too little too late and lacked genuine understanding of what he actually done wrong. The script felt corporate, devoid of real emotion or comprehension. Filipino commentators pointed out that he apologized for being ignorant but didn't acknowledge the deeper issue, the inherent cultural supremacy in his original comments, the assumption that Western electronic music was somehow the peak of musical evolution. Others noted that he apologized to people he offended, but didn't seem to grasp that he denigrated an entire cultural heritage. The backlash to his apology was almost as intense as the original controversy.
But then, something unexpected happened. Maria Santos, the Kulintang master whose video had helped spark the global response, posted a response to Lars's apology. "I accept that he is sorry, but sorry is just words. If he truly wants to understand, he should learn. My door is open." This moment of grace from someone who had every right to remain angry shifted the narrative dramatically. Other Filipino musicians echoed Maria's sentiment. They weren't interested in destroying Lars, they were interested in education. Within a week, a crowdfunding campaign was launched by Filipino-Swedish community organizers to bring Lars to the Philippines for a cultural immersion experience. The goal was to raise enough money to cover his travel and accommodation for 2 weeks, during which he would learn about Filipino musical traditions firsthand. The campaign reached its goal in less than 48 hours, with excess funds designated to support programs teaching traditional Filipino instruments to young people. Lars, humbled and clearly shaken by the entire experience, accepted the invitation. He posted another video, this one unscripted and far more genuine, expressing gratitude and nervousness about the opportunity. 2 months later, Lars arrived in Manila. What followed was documented in a series of videos that would collectively garner over 20 million views. Maria Santos welcomed him to her home in Mindanao, where she'd been teaching Kulintang for over 30 decades. The first lesson was humbling. Lars, who had confidently dismissed the instrument as primitive, couldn't produce a single coherent melody after hours of trying. The coordination required to play multiple gongs simultaneously while maintaining rhythmic complexity proved far beyond his current skill set.
"This is harder than any electronic music production I've ever done," he admitted on camera, sweat dripping down his face after attempting a basic pattern for the 30th time. Maria smiled gently. Music is not about evolution or superiority. It's about culture, story, and soul. This instrument doesn't need to be complicated by your standards. It needs to speak truth by ours. Over the following days, Lars met with various musicians, historians, and community elders. He learned about the Kulintang's role in courtship rituals, how specific melodies were played during harvests, how the instrument communicated stories across generations when written language wasn't accessible. He visited communities where instrument making was a family tradition spanning centuries, where the crafting of a single Kulintang gong required knowledge of metallurgy, acoustics, and cultural significance passed down through apprenticeship. He attended a traditional ceremony where Kulintang, alongside other instruments like the agung and dabakan, created soundscapes that moved him to tears. "I call this kitchen noise," he said in one video, his voice cracking with emotion. "But this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And it's beautiful not despite its age or simplicity, but because of the weight of history and meaning it carries." Lars also met with contemporary Filipino musicians who were incorporating traditional instruments into modern genres. He collaborated with a Manila-based producer who showed him how Kulintang samples could be used in electronic music respectfully, as a bridge between traditions rather than a replacement of them. Together, they created a track that blended Lars's electronic production skills with traditional Filipino instrumentation, with all proceeds going to organizations preserving indigenous musical traditions. The transformation in Lars was visible and seemingly genuine. By the end of his 2-week immersion, Lars had gone from an ignorant critic to a humble student and, surprisingly, an advocate. He returned to Sweden and immediately began using his platform, which had paradoxically grown during the controversy, to highlight Filipino musicians and traditional music from cultures worldwide. His content shifted dramatically. Instead of reaction videos filled with dismissive commentary, he created educational content, exploring different musical traditions with respect and curiosity. He partnered with musicians from various indigenous communities to create a series called Musical Heritage, where traditional instrument players taught viewers about their craft. His collaboration track with the Manila producer became unexpectedly popular in both electronic music circles and among world music enthusiasts, introducing thousands of new listeners to Filipino traditional sounds. More importantly, the entire saga had created lasting impact beyond just Lars's personal redemption arc. Music education programs in several countries began incorporating more diverse musical traditions into their curricula. Streaming platforms created dedicated categories for traditional and indigenous music, giving these artists better visibility. Several Filipino musicians reported significant increases in their international bookings and collaboration requests. The controversy became a case study in several universities about digital activism, cultural preservation, and the power of digital communities to defend their heritage. Maria Santos was invited to speak at international music conferences about traditional Filipino instruments, bringing global attention to forms of music that had been marginalized for decades. Young Filipinos reported feeling more connected to their cultural heritage, with enrollment in traditional music classes across the Philippines increasing by over 40% in the year following the incident. What started as one Swedish musician's ignorant comments had accidentally created one of the most significant moments of cultural education and preservation the internet had witnessed. It demonstrated the power of digital communities to unite across borders in defense of heritage. It showed that accountability doesn't mean destruction, that education can be more powerful than cancellation. And it proved that traditional music, far from being primitive or outdated, carries wisdom, complexity, and beauty that deserves respect and preservation. Lars's journey from antagonist to advocate wasn't the end of this story, but rather the beginning of a broader conversation about how we value and respect diverse cultural expressions in an increasingly connected world. The Kulintang's voice, once dismissed as kitchen noise, had spoken truth to ignorance and won.